Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome, everyone. It is so exciting to be here with you. We're going to get started now. It is wonderful to see you all. We have 600 people registered for this webinar, and we're very happy to be able to present it with you and share our time with you today. I'm Shelley Rude-Wernick, and I'm the Managing Director of our Center on Aging, Trauma, and Holocaust Survivor Care, which we call the Center for short. Thank you for joining us as we learn together the foundations of the person-centered, trauma-informed approach. Next slide. Today, we'll be learning about trauma, its impact on older adults, and how we can use the person-centered, trauma-informed approach to help. A few housekeeping items. Can you go back? Thank you. A few housekeeping items. As you can read the objectives of our webinar up on your screen, but I just wanted to let you know that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording and the PowerPoint PDF will be distributed to all people who registered after the webinar. It'll also be available on our website for anyone who has missed it. Please, if you have questions as you're listening, go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat, but the Q&A part. We're not able to unmute the lines or call on people to speak up, so we will look in that Q&A section to be able to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. And after the webinar is over, please complete a brief survey about it, and it'll pop up on your screen. For now, we'd love for you to rename your Zoom name so that anyone who sees participants will know who is participating in this webinar, and you can name your Zoom name, your first name and last name, and if you choose the organization that you represent. Go ahead and change to the next slide, please. As I said, my name is Shelley Rude-Wernick. I'm the Managing Director of our Center on Aging, Trauma, and Holocaust Survivor Care here at the Jewish Federations of North America. A little bit about us, we represent the Jewish federations and social service agencies throughout the country who help communities of all faiths, religions, backgrounds, races in the provision of social services throughout the life course. We've learned from Holocaust survivors throughout the years. Holocaust survivors have a trauma history by definition, and we've seen how that history plays out throughout the life course. We've seen how it plays out as people are growing up, as they're raising families of their own, working, retirement, and now reaching the end of their lives. Many Holocaust survivors didn't have normal models of aging, as many of them were orphans, and they didn't get the opportunity to watch their parents reach this age. So we learn a lot from Holocaust survivors about how trauma plays out in aging services and in family caregiving relationships. Based on this learning, we developed the person-centered, trauma-informed approach, and we see its applicability to diverse populations and settings. And that's what we're here to present today, the person-centered, trauma-informed approach and its uses in aging services and organizational culture. We've been partners with the Administration for Community Living since 2015 to advance person-centered, trauma-informed care for Holocaust survivors, diverse older adults with history of trauma, and their family caregivers. And we do this in two ways. We issue subgrants to local service providers, and we provide education and training, such as this program today. We learn best practices from our subgrantees and share them with others in the Aging Network. We also research the impact of person-centered trauma-informed programs on older adults' well-being, on organizational culture, and we seek to measure the capacity of aging service providers to implement PCTI concepts in their work. We have 3 expert presenters to share with you the foundations of the person-centered, trauma-informed approach and its uses. Next slide. Carly Brusky is the Assistant Director for Strategic Partnerships at the Center. Carly has worked in the nonprofit sector for 15 years with a focus on person-centered, trauma-informed care. And her areas of expertise include older adult services, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Bradley Heller is a project manager at the center, and his responsibilities include providing technical assistance, coaching, and grant oversight to our subgrantees. Throughout his career, Bradley has focused on housing, social services, and healthcare, and has worked with Doctors Without Borders in countries in Africa and spent 2 years in Costa Rica with the Peace Corps. And Alana Napo is project manager at this center, where she provides technical assistance, capacity building, systems improvement, and program analysis. Alana has managed programs across the nonprofit field at hospice organizations, Habitat for Humanity, and the Older Adults Services Department at the Jewish Family Services in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Thank you very much, Carly, Bradley, and Alana for presenting to us today. First up, I'd like to welcome Bradley to speak about trauma. Bradley, I can't hear you if you're speaking.
I'm here.
Oh, now I can hear and see you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Shelley. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Foundations of PCTI. My name is Bradley Heller. I'm glad you're joining us. The focus of this training is to introduce you to the person-centered trauma-informed approach, which has been developed to support those who have experienced trauma. Before we get into the approach, we need to talk for a moment about trauma. So what is trauma? Next slide, please. There's no singular definition of trauma, but we use this one. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. There are a few concepts I want to highlight here. Next slide, please. Trauma can result from one event, like a car accident, or trauma can occur over time, as with ongoing domestic violence. It can also be a reaction to a set of circumstances, such as institutionalized racism or government oppression. Next slide, please. Determining whether an event is traumatic is up to the individual experiencing that event. Trauma is based on an individual's perspective and reflection of their experience. An event that is traumatizing for one person may not be for another. Two soldiers experienced the same event during war, and one develops PTSD and the other didn't. It's well documented that people who experience the same traumatic event can have different reactions. Next slide, please. In my past work with people experiencing homelessness, there's the event of becoming homeless, which is terrible for everyone. What is significant is that some people respond quickly, find housing, and put the event behind them. Others remained in the shelter for months, refusing help, sinking into depression, unable to come to terms with what had happened. The two people experiencing a similarly impactful event, but in the second case, the experience had a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning. In trauma, there is an inherent loss of safety, power, and control. There is the risk of re-traumatization and the resurfacing of trauma-related behaviors as people age. Next slide, please. You can see here that trauma is linked to different health conditions. Dementia is one risk, important for all of us, considering the population we work with. Perhaps some of you are surprised to see the variety of physical health problems like lung disease or reproductive disorders because you associate trauma only with mental conditions. The damage from the trauma on the human body is broad and extensive. Next slide, please. It is important to be familiar with the concept of triggers, which is a stimulus that prompts traumatic response and includes the senses, so sound, smell, touch, sight, taste, feel, or it can be a circumstance that reminds an individual of a past trauma. Once experienced, triggers can elicit a fight, flight, or freeze response in the body. Examples of things that can trigger a trauma response are fireworks for veterans, as they mimic the sound of gunfire, medical procedures for Holocaust survivors from the many decades ago in concentration camps. For refugees, elections can be associated with violence and instability, so those feelings can be arose in them. These are three examples, but there are many, many possible triggers depending on the person and the events. As you will see shortly, avoiding triggers and re-traumatization is a crucial part of the PCTI approach. So how many people are affected by trauma? Next slide, please. Trauma is so prevalent, more prevalent than most people think. It's straightforward to think about Holocaust survivors and what they have experienced. Most people are familiar with veterans and refugees suffering from trauma. There are also survivors of floods, hurricanes, school shootings, terrorist attacks, and victims of abuse. Also, consider the LGBTQ plus community, Black or African Americans, American Indians, and Asian Americans, all of whom have faced the trauma of systemic racism. 90% is almost everyone. For this reason, we use universal precautions for trauma when working with your clients. In other words, assume that trauma is present. During the pandemic, medical personnel didn't wait for a positive diagnosis of COVID before putting on a mask and gloves. They assumed that every patient they saw had COVID. Next slide, please. So now we get to the person-centered trauma-informed approach. So what is it? Next slide, please. First, understand that the PCTI approach comes from a combination of two different principles. Next. There are the trauma-informed principles and, next, the person-centered principles. These two components will work together. More on that in a moment. Next slide, please. The person-centered trauma-informed approach is a holistic model of care that promotes the health and well-being of individuals by accounting for the role of trauma across the life course and by resisting re-traumatization, while also focusing on the strength, agency, and dignity of the person receiving care. Next slide. I want to highlight accounting for. For me, this recognizes that PCTI is not a treatment modality, so you don't need to be a psychologist, therapist, or social worker to implement this. You simply need to recognize or account for the fact that populations we work with and the colleagues that we work with have experienced trauma. Remember the 90% statistic and remember universal precautions. Therefore, you as a volunteer or staff member, whether you are a direct service provider, executive, or an accountant, you must be trauma aware and informed with everyone. Again, assume there is trauma. We also encourage it as a philosophy for your entire agency. More information on that concept later on. Next slide, please. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach. Next. The first one is safety. A person feels both physically and psychologically safe. Remember that trauma causes a person to feel unsafe. It may include anticipating people's needs, such as setting up waiting room chairs so that survivors of sexual violence won't have to brush arms. It's also about recognizing and reacting to specific situations that occur. For example, you work in a friendly visitor program. You knock on the door to announce your arrival, and the participant, a Holocaust survivor, opens the door in an agitated state. Using your familiarity with PCTI, you connect the fact that the knocking triggers memories from decades ago when a knock at the door was associated with traumatic events. Perhaps a phone call or ringing the doorbell would be a more PCTI way to announce yourself. Next. Trustworthiness and transparency. Organizations that are open and forthright about their policies, procedures, and programming will inherently create a sense of trust for both clients and staff. When you say you will complete a task for your client, and you do, you are laying the foundation for a trusting relationship. When a supervisor is clear about the expectations for their staff, they are being transparent. Next slide. We use the term peer to refer to individuals with similar lived experiences. An example of peer support, an organization runs socialization activities. They plan to identify a volunteer group made up of clients who participate in these activities to assist with engaging and supporting their peers. A strong connection to their peers can help increase recruitment of new volunteers and keep activities relevant and interesting. A separate example of the peer support approach is the Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous model, where success is achieved by peers through mutual support. Next. Collaboration and mutuality. Importance is placed on partnering and leveling power differences between staff and clients. Planning activities together with clients is an example of this. Next. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Throughout the organization and among the clients served, the strengths and experiences of individuals are recognized and built upon. An organization running a food delivery program has a system that allows their clients to interact with a known volunteer. These are the principles of safety and trust. And additionally, the clients also choose the specific food they want and even the store where they want to get it from. This is voice, choice, and empowerment. This allows the individual to feel a sense of control over the process, which is lost in the experience of trauma. Next. And the last one is cultural, historical, and gender considerations. Providing culturally responsive care and support that account for historical trauma, traditional cultural practices, justice, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. As we now go through the principles of the person-centered approach, think about the ways they interact with trauma-informed principles. Next. The first one is personalization, care based on the unique needs, goals, preferences, strengths, and values of each individual receiving support. Next. Self-determination, individuals direct their own care and are empowered to identify, pursue, and achieve their own goals and full potential. Next. Coordination is when care providers work in partnership and coordination with an individual, their support system, and other providers. And the last one, next, is respect. Everyone is treated with respect, compassion, and dignity, including the clients, their families, and staff. Next slide, please. Traditionally, the person-centered approach and the trauma-informed approach have been used separately. This wheel gives a visual as to how they come together to form the PCTI approach. The person-centered principles are on the outside part of this wheel, and the trauma-informed principles are on the inside. The principles of trauma-informed care should be implemented through the lens of person-centered principles. And now the wheel will spin. Next, please. So this represents the idea that any of the person-centered principles can be matched to any of the trauma-informed principles. Let's look at a couple of examples. Next. So take the person-centered category of respect. Next. Addressing older adults by Mrs. or Mr. rather than by first name is often done based on cultural considerations. Next. Recognizing that many cultures use these more formal greetings. You are implementing the trauma-informed principles through the lens of being person-centered. This is an example of where the approaches come together nicely. Next, please. Next slide. Let's look at a different example that is perhaps not as complementary. When we think about safety, making sure that our clients feel safe, let's look at that principle through the lens of self-determination. Next. You all work with older adults. You might refrain from a particular field trip due to concerns about mobility and the risk of injury. But what happens when that is exactly the outing the clients most want to go on? Safety has sort of butted heads against self-determination. Am I saying that you should have that outing because the clients want to? Not necessarily. Am I saying that the safety of the clients is the only consideration? I'm not saying that either. What I am saying is that in order to be person-centered and trauma-informed, you have to consider both self-determination and safety in that decision. I hope that is clear for people. Next, you will hear from my colleague, Alana.
Thank you, Bradley. Abby, next slide, please. Thank you. So at this time, I'm going to continue taking us through some specific strategies, stories, and examples of how to implement the PCTI approach. And we'll be talking about this in 3 different settings. So one is in direct care, face-to-face with clients, and then also organizationally in terms of how we interact with our coworkers in the workplace. And then finally, within our organization's policies and procedures. And I'll be talking through the 6 trauma-informed principles in each of these settings. And I think you'll hear how the person-centered principles come through as well. So before I go on, you may have noticed that there have been some difficult topics that have come up around loss and death. And trauma, obviously, we know that's what we've been working with, but I want to make sure that you are taking care of yourselves. If you hear anything that's difficult for you and you need to take a break or mute for a little bit, we won't know, but we will understand. And if this presentation were in person, I would tell you that it's okay to get up and leave the room if you need to, and it wouldn't be considered rude. And I will not be going into details on these stories. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first, we're going to talk through these 6 principles of the trauma-informed approach in the setting of direct service. And I want to recognize that a lot of our attendees in the room today are direct service providers, maybe social workers, case managers, aides, things like that. And for those of you who aren't, I think it'll inform your work as well. So you may notice that some of the strategies and examples I provide could fall under multiple principles, and that's okay. We see that a lot. And finally, before we jump in, I'd like to recognize that there's an incredible level of experience and expertise and skills in the audience today. So as I'm talking, you might think of your own examples in your work, and I would really welcome you to enter those in the chat so we can all learn from you. But do please remember to enter questions in the Q&A box, which I see many of you are. Thank you. Next slide, please. So before I continue, I'd like to point out that I'm not going to be reading each bullet point aloud to you, but rather that they're going to serve as a reference to you later in the PDF of the PowerPoint slides that we'll send out after the presentation. And you might notice that many of these slides or even bullet points could probably be expanded on into their own webinar. So instead, I'm going to be pulling out a few of the points and illustrating them through examples. And if you have any questions about any of the other ones I didn't touch on out loud, you can, again, enter questions in the Q&A, or you can email us after, and we'll provide our email as well. So talking through safety in direct service, Bradley gave some excellent examples earlier, and you may be surprised to learn that many of the strategies we'll be talking about can be implemented at little or no cost to your organization. So one excellent example that comes to mind of the safety principle in direct service is with an organization we're currently working with. They are working within a senior living community and hosting a drumming group for residents who have dementia and aren't able to express themselves verbally. So the music is a way they can express themselves. And where you see the safety principle in that is that it takes place on a terrace overlooking a beautiful bay, but it's in small groups of 5 to 6 residents at a time so that they have adequate space to spread out. They're not going to be knocking into each other, but also so that adequate staffing can be provided to meet each resident's need. And another piece that brings safety into this is that we know that the group activity is held in a separate space than where other residents may be on that floor, so that those residents who might find the drumming sounds disturbing or triggering won't be as exposed to them. I'd also like to briefly share a personal story that happened last week, and this was an example of where we didn't see the safety principle in effect, which I think can be just as informative. So this was at a medical appointment I was attending within a large healthcare campus. And in the middle of my appointment, I heard a loud tone come over the loudspeaker, followed by a voice. And before I could even process what the voice was saying, my mind was already racing to, is this an emergency? Is there a tornado? Or is there an active shooter or a terrorist attack? And I then realized that it was a prayer. The voice was reciting a prayer over the loudspeaker, which probably had the intent of comforting patients. But in my case, I also realized that that took me right back to over 20 years ago when something similar happened on September 11th. And part of the reason I use this example is because it can show how trauma triggers aren't just for the individual experiences we've had, but can be for collective traumas. Next slide, please. There's many ways we can promote trustworthiness and transparency in direct service as well. So simple things we can do are introducing ourselves to clients, explaining our role, the purpose of the meeting, what to expect, and next steps. And also checking for understanding as you go. I know we're often under time constraints, but allowing clients to take the space they need to process, take breaks, will help you establish trust and possibly save you time with them later. So there's one area we, in our work with older adults and survivors of trauma, often come across, which is that can be challenging for clients, which is taking intake assessments or interviews, things like that, where we have to ask a lot of personal questions and for personal information, and where the survivor of trauma may have to recount traumatic events. So how can we set that up in a way that helps establish trust is explaining why we need the information we're asking for and explaining how we're going to protect it and keep it confidential. And we have to remember that for a lot of the folks we work with, especially Holocaust survivors, they have survived a time when they were counted in order to be hunted. So that's why it can be triggering for a lot of survivors and also refugees. So I do want to let you know that some of the topics we're talking about do actually have their own webinars devoted to them, and you'll get the link to our webinar library after today. There is one about trauma-informed intake interviews and applications. Next slide, please. So there's also so many ways to incorporate peer support into your direct services, and Bradley gave some great examples. Another example I want to highlight comes from an organization we're working with. They work with clients who are coping with hoarding disorder, and they have a program in place where clients who have graduated from the program become mentors and leaders to new clients entering the program, and they work with them in support groups and other areas. So imagine the difference it would make to hear from a leader in the work you're doing who has successfully gone through what you're going through. And not only in our direct service, but in our outreach to potential clients for recruitment. For example, we have an organization who works with second-generation Holocaust survivors. So those are the adult children of survivors. And they have unique trauma histories of their own. So in one particular organization, they actually have some board members who are part of this demographic who have engaged with outreach to new clients. Next slide, please. So remembering that collaboration and mutuality is about leveling power differences as much as possible, I think about the provider-client relationship where inherently the provider is in a position of power in reference to the client. So how can we level that? We want to provide clients with as many opportunities as we can to shape their own experiences with us, so the programs and services they receive. And we can do that through surveys and through listening to the feedback that they provide and acting on it. And one great example comes to us from an organization we worked with who particularly worked with Holocaust survivors who were from the former Soviet Union. And they shared with the organization that they didn't feel like they were part of the larger Jewish community. So staff at the organization worked together with this population of clients to see how can they help them feel more welcomed? So instead of prescribing solutions and basically mandating them, the staff worked together with the clients, and they came up with the idea of creating a mosaic mural that's now hanging in the lobby of the building where the clients receive services, so that they can always feel that they've been recognized. So they've shared that they have felt more valued, and they've also participated more in the services that are available to them and programs. And it also, of course, helped other new clients come on board as well from that population. Next slide, please. So empowerment, voice, and choice, there's some easy ways to promote this and the first one is just to ensure that you've informed the client of all the services that are available to them and that they can opt in and out at any time without any kind of penalty. And that they can share their feedback without any kind of penalty. They're not going to lose access to service if they share critical feedback with you. So another time that this comes up is when we really need to, we respect that our clients may make different decisions than we anticipate we may have made had we been in the same situation. So we had a story where this happened, where we were working with an organization, again, serving Holocaust survivors, and the social worker who visited the client's apartment noticed that the shades were always drawn. It was always dark in there, always quiet. And she asked the client if she could open the shades to let in the sunshine, and thinking he would say, oh, of course, I couldn't reach them or something like that. But it turned out he preferred not to have the shades open. And that was because he survived the Holocaust in hiding with others. And in that time, darkness meant safety, because exposure in light brought your hiding to light and everyone who was hiding with you and who was hiding you, and they could all very likely face death if that were the case. So this survivor equated darkness with safety. Next slide, please. So I think within those examples, you've probably heard a lot of how cultural, historical, and gender considerations overlap working with these very specific populations. But we really can't overstate its importance. So one thing we recommend is ensuring that frontline staff are trained in the unique needs of whatever population you're serving, so that they can avoid any triggers that would re-traumatize your clients. Another way you can honor the backgrounds of your clients is to provide services and resources in the language that is preferred and also culturally translated. So one of the organizations we're working with currently is working on an end-of-life resource, and they are translating it into Russian for their clients from the former Soviet Union, but they're also thinking about how to translate it culturally, meaning that are there certain phrases and terms that we use that are mainstream, but could be really off-putting to that population. So instead of calling it an end-of-life resource, they might call it something like help during difficult times, something that's more palatable. Next slide, please. So I want to take a look through a quick case study. This is, you're seeing a gentleman served by one of the organizations we've worked with, who was a Holocaust survivor, and he was near end of life. He's with his spouse there, and he's holding a life lessons book. So this was a project of the organization where they took down clients' stories with them and put them into a book that they could keep and their families could keep. So how might this interaction of the client and his spouse participating in this program been done according to the trauma-informed principles in the lens of the person-centered principles? So starting with safety, the visits took place in the client's home where he felt safe, with a care manager who was vetted and background checked, and he was made aware of that. In trustworthiness and transparency, the care manager explained the goals of the project to the client and his spouse clearly, how each step would be carried out, and allowed a lot of space for questions. For peer support, the clients were shown examples of other life lessons books from previous clients with permission, and we're invited to contact some of those clients with permission as well with questions. And collaboration and mutuality, the nature of the project was to elicit participation and decisions directly from the client and spouse. So it was really not prescribed by the care manager, this is what you're going to do, but they came to that together. For empowerment, voice, and choice, the client was presented with options of whether or not to participate, he'd like to participate, when and where to meet, what he did and didn't want included in the project. And this honored the client from a cultural, historical background and lens, because the care manager had to demonstrate enormous sensitivity to the client as he shared his stories, which were often of difficult situations. And the client did express that the project was honoring his family who suffered during the war, and it gave him the opportunity to think of himself as a Holocaust survivor. Next slide, please. So we're gonna now move into looking at how these principles apply in an organizational setting. And why is it important to talk about in an organizational setting? One, because I know many of you in the room are not in direct service roles, but are in programmatic or leadership roles. But also because we know that when we aren't doing our best as staff, we don't do our best for clients. We could burn out, we could see a lot of turnover and things like that in the workplace. So it's also important because in the same way that clients have experienced trauma, so have those who make up our workforces. If you remember the 90% stat that Bradley presented, that by the time we reach older adulthood, 90% of us will have experienced a traumatic event. This could be in employees' own personal lives and histories, in past workplaces, or in the vicarious or secondary trauma that can accumulate over time working with the populations we serve. So the PCTI practices in the workplace encourage staff to stick around and give their best. Next slide, please. So you may notice that some of the items in the bullet points are repeated in direct service because safety matters just as much for staff. And remembering that safety is both psychological and physical, one of the best things I can tell you is to encourage honest feedback without any retaliation. And retaliation isn't always formal. It could be whispering, it could be eye rolling, it could be gossiping or being ignored. So we can think about how we can create safety for each other in these settings. Next slide, please. To establish trust and transparency, one of the, I think, best ways we can build trust is through following through with what we say we're going to do when we say we're going to do it, and taking accountability on those times that something goes wrong. And if you think about accountability, if you've ever worked with a coworker who made a mistake, did they own up to it? And try to correct it, or did they hope no one would notice? And which helped you build trust more? Being transparent about our own work to others, even in those uncomfortable situations, will go a long way towards maintaining trust. Next slide, please. So we've got some great examples of organizations providing peer support amongst staff. And one is where the organization consistently provides time in meetings to debrief about challenging client situations, whether that's an ongoing situation or whether it's the grief and loss that you feel as staff when a client you've had a relationship with for a long time passes. Next slide, please. Collaboration and mutuality can, if we remember, it's about leveling power differences. I think about the organizational hierarchy. So this principle calls on us to value the input and voices from everywhere on that employee hierarchy, every level in between. For example, our frontline staff often have the most accurate knowledge of what your clients would benefit from, what ideas are going to be feasible on the ground. So taking those voices into account. And you can also solicit employee contributions for feedback in meeting agendas in advance, or how a meeting went after, and how to improve future employee interactions. Next slide, please. So empowerment, voice, and choice. There's ways. We want to recognize that most of the components of our job descriptions are not optional. However, there are ways to empower staff within their roles and within the workplace. So are there special projects or professional development opportunities that you can make available to employees that they can opt in or out of? Does an employee have expertise in a certain area that they can take on training other staff in, things like that? And we also recognize in empowerment, voice, and choice that the practices we do in the workplace are not always going to be one size fits all. For example, when I worked with volunteers at a previous organization, they didn't all want to be recognized in the same way. Some love to get a lot of attention on social media and publicly at meetings with tributes, but others would be mortified by that level of spotlight. So rather than shining a spotlight on someone without asking them in advance, we made sure to ask, and we also made sure to honor those requests if someone would rather just receive a bouquet of flowers and a card. So I'm wondering from the group, how do you prefer to be recognized at work? And you can let us know in the chat. Next slide, please. So cultural, historical, and gender considerations are just as important for our staff as for our clients. We recognize the diversity of staff in our organizations, and we want everyone to feel included, welcomed, and honored. So one way to do that is to ensure that the major events that you host aren't conflicting with significant religious holidays. So I know a lot of us in the Jewish Human Service agencies can probably think of a time we wanted to attend an event or conference, but it overlapped with the high holidays. And similarly, you'd want to be mindful of fasting holidays. For example, you wouldn't want to hold a volunteer appreciation dinner during Ramadan when observant Muslims are fasting. And then another thing you can do is make sure you're trying to bring on staff and volunteers who reflect the populations you serve. So that carries over into building trust as well once you have. Next slide, please. So I want to put in a quick plug for this article recently published in Psychology Today that Shelley, who led us off in the presentation, co-authored. And that's going to be coming through to you in a link after the presentation. And thank you for those sharing in the chat. How do you prefer to be recognized? I'd love to see if you can elevate my point that there's a lot of variety in what people prefer. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about policies and procedures. And why is this important to talk about? It's not always the most fun subject, but it's so important because our policies and procedures are what cement the PCTI approach into our workplaces. They're what make it part of what we do, the fabric of what we do, and they're what make it not optional. And next slide, please. Thank you. So if we look at safety in the context of policies and procedures, one of the first things I always think of is creating and defining clear policies and reporting avenues for an employee is experiencing bullying, harassment, or discrimination. So there's ways to make this clear so that employees just reading the policy, even before they come into the organization, know that they'll be protected if anything happens. So I have an example for you of years ago at an organization I worked with. I was reviewing some of the policies and I looked at their anti-discrimination and harassment policy, and I noticed that all of the consequences outlined were left to the discretion of the manager. There was nothing that said if this happens, you could be terminated. It was all discretion of the manager. And I met with the head of the HR, Human Resources or HR department, and let him know that that was concerning because That means that one employee could be punished in a certain way for something, a certain action, and another employee could be punished in a different way for the same action. And it all depends on the manager. It could depend on their biases or favoritism. And we know that often disproportionately negatively affects people from minoritized backgrounds. So as I raised this to the HR director, he said, well, I hope that wouldn't happen. And that's why I want to point out to you that as important as hope is in the work that we do, hope is not a policy. That's why planning and writing things down are so important, because we can't always rely on hope for people to do the right thing. Next slide, please. So trustworthiness and transparency, one easy way to do this in your policies is just to make them as accessible as possible. So all new employees know exactly where to go to find them and who in HR or their manager they can approach if they have questions. Next slide, please. Here's support in your policies, and in this case, I'm going to say procedures with the example I'm going to give. It's with my current organization. They do a great job of this. When we onboard new employees, each employee has a meeting scheduled in their first 2 weeks with each individual member one-on-one of their team, so that they can foster relationships and build rapport and get to know each other right from the start. And then in the larger staff meetings that happen about weekly with the entire organization, new staff are introduced and welcomed by the whole organization first thing on the agenda. Next slide, please. So collaboration and mutuality, again, I remind us that it's about leveling power differences. And this is where we want to make sure that our policies are being enforced across employees at all levels of the hierarchy and all positions. So we wouldn't want to have a case where one employee faces consequences for a certain action, but an employee of perhaps a higher standing doesn't. Next slide, please. Empowerment, voice, and choice. This might sound like a difficult one in terms of policies because so much of them are non-negotiable. But wherever there can be an opportunity for employees to help shape a policy, I encourage you to elicit those contributions. We're not saying that which policies they adhere to are optional, but just that their voices can be heard in the shaping of policies where that is possible. And next slide. Lastly, I want to talk about cultural, historical, and gender considerations in your policies and procedures. And if we go back to that anti-harassment, anti-bullying, and discrimination policy, I want to encourage you to recognize that if an employee comes to you with reporting a concern that they've experienced racism or homophobia or transphobia or sexism or sexual harassment or something like that in the workplace, that you're following your policy for follow-through. You're not saying things that would be dismissive or dehumanizing, like, oh, are you sure that's what they meant? Or you're being too sensitive. I suspect that many of us have had experiences like that. At the same time, I hope not. So we recognize that the person with the lived experience is the expert on their experience. So that wraps up my portion. Again, I'll encourage you to revisit the bullet points as a guide for you later on after today when you receive the PDF in an email. And at this point, I'm going to reintroduce my colleague Carly for the next portion.
Thank you, Alana, and hi, everybody. My name is Carly Brusky. I also work here at the center with Bradley and Alana. Today, I'd like to talk a bit about PCTI leadership, what that means, what it looks like, and how to start that journey to get there. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to echo many of Alana's fantastic points, so we will just go ahead and dive in. Next slide, please. There are many, many components to what makes up a PCTI leadership body. In a nutshell, PCTI aligned leaders should strive for a few big things. One being they are committed to understanding the massive prevalence and impact of trauma. That means among clients, staff, coworkers, volunteers, people in the community, everyone. Next, they're also working consistently to create a safe, supportive work environment that promotes resilience, healing, and positivity. They're establishing policies and protocols that lead to psychological safety for everyone, and they're working to cultivate an environment where it's okay for someone to admit that they're struggling a little bit and that they don't have the answer to everything. So if an organization does not embrace PCTI and if staff members do not feel safe going to their supervisors with their concerns, these concerns will compound over time and lead to things like burnout, compassion fatigue, and other symptoms of work trauma. So when the work environment itself is toxic to the workforce, it will hinder the ability of staff to deliver respectful, individualized, collaborative, and client-centered care to service recipients. Therefore, it's really critical that an organization's leadership team understands the reality of secondary trauma and works to avoid it and at the very least address it sensitively. Next slide, please. A PCTI leadership body should always be self-reflecting and self-evaluating its power. That means working toward power sharing or power leveling versus power hoarding. So how do we make that happen? One way is by ensuring that individuals with trauma histories and lived experience are in leadership positions and involved in the planning and decision-making of the organization. Another way is for staff at all levels of an organization to be regularly brought in as thought leaders and to be given the opportunity to own different parts of this PCTI work. Trust and transparency are absolute musts. Leadership should show transparency with organizational operations and demonstrate regular open communication with staff regarding the agency's PCTI commitment and vision. That means following up on things in a timely manner and making sure that staff know they can talk to their supervisors and the leadership body without fear of retribution. Unsurprisingly, people tend to feel more comfortable and confident at work when they know what's going on. So when they're in the know, when they fully understand the rules, their expectations, and they're getting consistent updates, that just furthers a healthy work environment. Next slide, please. So here are some tangible ways to be a PCTI supervisor or to create a PCTI leadership body. I'm not going to dive deeply into all of these examples just in the interest of time, but I am happy to talk more about them offline. If anybody is interested, please feel free to reach out after this webinar. One example, one concrete way that an agency can start their PCTI implementation is by administering an agency self-assessment to see where they are in terms of trauma readiness. There are a bunch of free ones out there. They're easily pullable. I can send them out if anybody is interested. But an assessment will really generate that data that you're looking for. It'll be data around the organization's trauma-informed quality assurance protocols, policy and procedure review, and what the organizational culture looks like so that the agency can determine what their areas of strength are, what their areas of needed improvement are. And again, it's just a really great concrete starting point to build that PCTI infrastructure. Another way is for leadership to establish steps to ensure that the staff has an understanding of how and why PCTI concepts are infused into the agency's overall mission and their values and their vision. Is leadership being accountable to that PCTI vision that they laid out, and are they modeling those expectations for the rest of the staff? That's the big question. And then similarly, is the PCTI language and the principles of the approach that we just went over built into other organizational aspects as well? So is PCTI reflected in your grant applications, in your fundraising and outreach initiatives, in your marketing materials? Has your board had a PCTI 101 training? Ultimately, is PCTI present to some degree across your day-to-day work? Next, leadership can be advocates for staff and or client-led advisory councils or PCTI champion committees. Having some sort of PCTI governing body and sharing the ownership of the organization's PCTI work is really helpful, and it garners that buy-in from staff. The committee can be a liaison between staff and leadership. It can develop a standards of practice for PCTI implementation. It can find training opportunities, help brainstorm staff support initiatives. There's really a million things this committee can do. And again, it's incredibly helpful to the overall work of embedding the PCTI infrastructure into the agency. Staff support is a big topic, so I do have a few subtopics that I want to talk about quickly. Leadership can support an organizational structure of trauma-informed supervision for everyone. So trauma-informed supervision creates a platform for staff to have a voice and a choice. It facilitates power and value in their work relationships. And it's really a fantastic space to highlight professional strengths and areas of growth. And it gives you, the space to lay out professional goals moving forward. So there's no confusion around what both parties are working on, supervisor and supervisee. And then next up, I just want to chat about staff investment, which is another big one. So when an organization's leadership shows that it values its staff, it provides competitive salaries, competitive benefits, it fosters a safe work environment, it really supports everybody having manageable workloads, and it helps pave the way for staff to have input into those administrative policy decisions. And when we commit to this as a leadership, it really helps staff feel connected to the large mission of the agency and also committed to that long-term sustainability and growth of the agency. It also shows that leadership just respects staff, respects the complexities of their job every day, respects and appreciates the complexities around working with survivors of trauma, working with clients that have experienced trauma, as well as staff themselves who may have experienced trauma. And then lastly, consistent and ongoing training and education, which seems pretty self-explanatory, but it's really, really important. Leadership should be making sure that staff has regular PCTI infused and job relevant training opportunities, as well as access to a diverse array of professional development options. So training really does enhance the skill level of staff, and it helps organizations stay relevant with best practices and changes in the field. It also helps us hone our practical skills, keep them sharp, and in general, it just keeps us being really impactful and effective advocates for our clients. And then at onboarding specifically, all new employees really should receive some type of PCTI orientation and basic education about the prevalence of trauma and its impact. That sets the stage for new staff to understand the true full meaning of PCTI and the tone and expectations of the agency around PCTI so that it's a part of their work from day one, moving forward into all the days that come. So that was a lot, and it wraps up my piece. Again, thank you all for listening, and I'm going to pass it now to my colleague, Amanda Jarvis, who will open this up to a larger Q&A for everyone. Thanks.
Hi there. Thank you. Thank you, Carly. Thank you, everyone, for presenting. I wanted to go over some of the questions that made it into the Q&A box. Please continue to add your questions to the question and answer text box. So the first question that we have is, can you help provide some resources for best practices for people working with Holocaust survivors from the former Soviet Union?
Yes, we absolutely could. The thing is, we have a treasure trove of resources, and probably I would say 2/3 of the agencies we've funded throughout the years, since we just recently got our grant to fund diverse populations, have been for Holocaust survivors, and most of them have been from the former Soviet Union. So if you want to reach out to us at aging@jewishfederations.org, we can provide more detailed information of what might be specifically useful to you.
Thank you. Somebody is curious if we could recommend any person-centered trauma-informed online trainings that they could share with their staff.
Hi, I can take this one. We actually have on our website a list of trainings that are available. There are some PowerPoints, they're in different formats. Some are online, some are more geared towards in-person, but you can look through the trainings that are up there that were produced by many of our partners in the field. And JFNA's center will also be producing an online training program that will be available starting this fall. That program will be free and open to anyone who wants it. And that will also be available on our website, agingandtrauma.org. And again, it'll be ready in the fall. It's not ready yet, but we're very excited. And everyone who's registered for this webinar will get the big announcement of when it's webinar, when it is released, and you'll know how to access it through that email. So stay tuned for that training program. But there are others available on our website, and we can send a link to those ones as well.
Thank you. If an agency wanted to assess how person-centered trauma-informed their agency is there any method by which they can assess that?
Amanda, could you say that? Could you repeat that question one more time? I'm sorry.
Sure. If an agency wanted to assess how person-centered and trauma-informed that agency was, so that they could see if there was room for improvement or promising practices, is there a way that they could assess their own person-centered trauma-informed approach?
I can talk about the trauma readiness assessment, and then if anybody else wants to jump in about PCTI in general, or maybe in a less structured way. But I'm happy to send out resources about an agency's trauma readiness assessment, because that really is, like I said, a great starting point for getting feedback from staff. It can be done anonymously by staff, and it focuses on these different quadrants, you know, direct services and workplace wellness and all these different areas, organizational culture. And then people can respond with how they view the agency or what their experiences at the agency are. And then you kind of know, like, this is a little bit weaker. Maybe we want to focus some time and attention here. Whereas a lot of people answered really high in this category, and it seems to be like we're okay. And then you can develop a standards of practice or next steps around what the data reveals from that, if that's helpful.
We also are going to send out some info in the follow-up email that will help you with that, actually related to a link that someone just posted in the chat.
Thank you so much. I'm going to run through a few more questions. Do we know of any resources for having end-of-life conversations, specifically in Russian?
We do. We have an organization working on that right now, so we can put you in touch if you want to send us an email afterwards. And our email will be in the PDF of the slides and in the email we're going to send you.
We also have a database of products that different subgrantees have created over the years, and we've funded a couple different agencies that have worked on end-of-life projects with Russian speakers. And so you may be able to find questions that have been asked in a PCTI way that were really thoughtfully drafted to help people think this through, and also guidance to service providers of how to even approach this topic. Lastly, I'd like to give a shout out to our colleagues in Los Angeles, who Beit Tzedek, who have really spearheaded a mission in working in end of life legal templates to work with Holocaust survivors, who many of them are from the former Soviet Union.
Thank you. This next question is considering Bradley's comment from earlier in the presentation about how self-determination and safety don't always align exactly. Can you talk a little bit to the way that the ability to make your own choices contributes to psychological safety, and how you balance that with maintaining physical safety?
I can speak to that a little bit, and then if anyone else wants to jump in. So we know that there's times that clients may have a preference for something that is just not going to be a safe option for them. A lot of times it could be, are they safe to live independently anymore? The answer may be no, but we know that that's their preference. So offering as many choices in other areas to help offset the impact of not being able to have choice where it affects safety can help with that. And what was the last part of that question?
It was, how do you balance providing somebody the psychological safety of self-determination with the physical safety of maybe not having that self-determination?
Yeah, basically providing any other opportunities for self-determination and choice that we can in any other areas of their work, and even if, or their lives, and even if there could be opportunities for choices within the changes that do need to be made for the client's safety, like maybe it has to do with where they might relocate to, and when, what they want to take, and things like that.
Thank you. This next question, Carly touched on a little bit when she was talking about leadership and PCTI. But somebody asked if we could talk a little bit more and delve a little bit deeper into how to promote a feeling of safety through empathetic leadership, and how to coordinate with your team in times of re-traumatization to promote a feeling of safety.
Well, I hesitate to say safe spaces in general because that really looks different to every single one of us. And just because I think something is a safe space doesn't mean someone else thinks it's a safe space. I do like the idea of psychological safety and talking about that a little bit more. I think giving staff the opportunity to provide feedback in a bunch of different ways, some of them being anonymous, is really important. If they feel like they can't go to their supervisor, is there someone else that they can go to? And is that person accountable to bringing that feedback back to the larger leadership? And then is that leadership doing something with it? If a PCTI leadership body is calling themselves PCTI, then again, they have to be modeling that and taking ownership and accountability of what that truly means in alignment with those principles. So I would say that having different avenues to provide feedback is really important, and making sure that staff really knows the resources available to them is really important, as well as having champions, PCTI champions across the agency who are well-versed in PCTI and able to advocate for other staff who may not feel like they have a voice, and be able to bring that forth to the larger leadership body. It's not easy, and it's often not comfortable, because even when a leadership body says it's safe, there's no retribution, that doesn't necessarily ring true for a lot of people. So there has to be some other workarounds there.
Thank you. I appreciated that deep dive. I I wanted to say there are so many more questions. And I also want to give my team the opportunity to provide the next steps. So I'm going to pass the mic back to my team to close us out.
So for next steps, we encourage you to check out our website, which is agingandtrauma.org. And on this website, you're going to see a slew of resources, everything from one-page fact sheets to recorded webinars on topics like hoarding or how trauma impacts the body and the brain, and different publications like how to make your meetings more person-centered, trauma-informed. Also, we invite you to come to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2025, when we will have our national premier training workshop. It's for service providers and experts in the fields of trauma and aging, and we encourage foundations, universities, think tanks, and others to come together and learn together and share promising practices. Also, if you're looking for an agency in your area to learn more about person-centered trauma-informed care, we have on our website a list of agencies that we funded over the years that have become leaders in this space. And there may be one near you, given that we have funded hundreds of projects over the past 9 years. And then lastly, we hope that you'll think about how you can better infuse a person-centered trauma-informed approach into your work. And after this webinar, we will have an evaluation that will pop up after this webinar, and we request that you please complete it so we can improve our future webinars. So with that, we just want to thank you so much for participating. The next slides show the resources that we use, so you're welcome to turn back to them. And we thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to working with you as we move forward. Take care.